Have you ever wondered what would it be like if you were born in the 1980s and 1990s and you only got stuck with a car with a stick and three pedals? Well, here's what you would do. Control the vehicle at speeds with only the use of legs and your feet, not computer. There is no technological advancement to control you with. And guess what? This is how manual transmission still dominated the modern day era. So, what exactly is a manual transmission and what does it do? Well, here's the thing, manual transmission is basically a transmission where the gears are shifted manually instead of using a computer box or shift sensor or likely an AI control system or likely without a shift monitor. Instead of monitoring your gear shifting, you have to shift with both your feet and your hands. And likely this was the main purpose of what it was like to shift a car by yourself instead of having technology do the hard work. So the first thing you need to do is that when you're driving manual transmission, you have to start with the obvious point. You have to start in first gear. If you say first gear, that means that you're only shifting in first and second. So likely, when you are accelerating, you have to upshift. Upshift is when your gears started to climb higher, you have to read your RPM gauges. But why should you read your RPM gauges before you shift? Well, it's this reason. When you're shifting a manual transmission, you got to learn how to check if your gear range and gear ratio is far enough when it's shifted at a certain selection, or likely you could shift at any moment or exactly at any time at any point. So when you're already maximizing gear revs, you're basically shifting a gear higher from first to second. Of course, when you're in the small neighborhood area, you're only shifting between first or second. Then once you get onto the public areas, likely a busy road, you'd likely shift higher between 3 and 4. And then there's the fifth gear. Fifth gear is likely overdrive, but also sixth gear. But there's another thing that you should know. If you know manual transmission and you have known it for a very long time in high school, there is this one thing. Why should you never shift the gear without clutching? Well, it's likely because it might damage the transmission. And here's when the obvious point gets even weirder. Manual transmission has three gears. Not three gears, but three pedals. The first pedal on your far right is the throttle. That's where you obviously notice in automatics. And then the middle section, which is the left, is the brake. And the third on the far left is what you call the clutch pedal. What's exactly with the clutch pedal doing with the manual transmission? Well, the clutch actually lets you disengage the transmission from stationary purpose. You see, in manual transmission, you basically have to disengage the clutch before you shift into a gear. And then there's the obvious point. Since you don't have a shift monitor or a shift meter to control a manual transmission, this is where the idea gets tricky. You don't actually necessarily have to read your RPM gauges. You just gotta learn when is the right time and when is the right way you're going to shift gears. Usually in off-roading, the manual transmission is the only purpose for you to go forward. So that way you can get enough engine power when you're driving forward, or likely it causes less fuel waste and likely it increases reliability for engines. Another thing that you should understand about manual transmission is Manual transmission is mostly likely used for heavy duty vehicles like trucks and buses, but modern day trucks and buses now use automatic transmissions while older vehicles use manual. Well, here's the thing that you should know about manual transmission. Usually in modern day vehicles, the base model is the only vehicle to have a manual transmission, nothing else. If you drove a base model car, you only get the manual transmission. But if you get the brand newer trim levels, you would likely get either automatic, a conventional converter transmission, or likely a button powered transmission. However, the base model is a lot more cheap because you only have reliability to do with when you're using a manual transmission. Real car lovers like driving manual vehicles because it makes their engines last longer and performance a little bit better. Manual transmission dominated the area today at some point. Modern generations don't usually know how to work button powered transmissions because likely manual transmission back in the 80s and 90s were the only things available today. In fact, if you want to know how to work manual transmission is, you gotta learn which gear goes in first. From first to second, third, fourth, and five. But how do you shift into reverse? Well, it's simple. You just have to shift the manual transmission onto the far left or right side of the transmission boot of the car and slide it down to R, which is likely the reverse gear. So it's quite obvious, really. The reverse gear actually switches places depending on transmission. In fifth gear, the reverse gear of the manual transmission is likely sitting underneath the number 5, or likely when it's 6th gear, it's usually beside gear 1, gear 2, or likely in between those other numbers as well. Manual transmission may be confusing to some beginners, but some professionals taught beginners how to use a manual transmission. The importance of manual transmission is making better engine revs and better performance. Usually in the Fast and Furious, their vehicles are always considered manual transmission because it helps the actors feel like they're in control of the vehicle, not the technology inside of the vehicle. This is likely the importance of manual transmissions. Manual transmissions really were a thing for the 80s and 90s, especially today. I hope you guys learned something from this video. Make sure that you go comment, like, and subscribe.